Dunrovin Ranch in Lolo, Montana. My name is Suzanne Miller. I'm the owner of Dunrovin Ranch, and I'm delighted to have Jim Robbins with us. Jim Robbins is an author. He lives in in Helena, Montana, and drove over just to meet with all of you. He's the author of this really wonderful book that I hope all of you have had a chance to read, called The Wonder of Birds. And I'm going to start with Jim and take a look at birds in general, and then we'll focus down on the ospreys. So Jim, you are a journalist, and what prompted you to dive so deeply into the bird world?
Well, for a lot of reasons, and one big one is because they're so beautiful. There's so many different colors and sizes, and they can do so many amazing things. Like an osprey that can catch fish out of a river, or a hummingbird that can hover in place to get nectar out of a flower and fly upside down and fly backwards. And in the range, I think there's around 10,000 bird species, and they're all incredible in their own way. So that's really the fascination and the charismatic nature of birds. It's just they fly and they own the sky, and that in itself is a wonder.
Yes, and I think one of the other things that you said yesterday that really captured me is that they seem to be one of our most vital connections to nature, because they occur everywhere, in urban areas,
Right.
in rural areas. If there's a tree, there's a bird. Is that about it?
Yep, and they in a lot of places they change all the time. You see a lot of different kinds. They've come through on their way somewhere else, and so a bird that's here today can be in South America in a couple of weeks because they migrate. So they cover a lot of territory, and they connect us to faraway places that way.
Yes. Yes. In fact, one of the things that I don't know if all of you know about ospreys is that they occur on every continent except Antarctica. So they are, I consider them an ambassador bird, because you can talk to almost anywhere in the world and you can talk about ospreys and they know what you're talking about. They unify us in that way. Your very first chapter, Jim, starts out with how birds are really the living dinosaurs. Could you explain that to the children?
Well, one scientist in the book says birds are the dinosaurs that made it. So the dinosaurs that were around 120, 30 million years ago were big and warm-blooded, we know now, and ruled the earth. Well, a lot of them died out, except those that became birds. So essentially, the birds we see around us are the modern-day descendants of those dinosaurs that ruled the planet so long ago. And they've adapted and changed over time to become birds, and that's how they survive. So they are a direct connection to the dinosaur. That bird in your bird feeder out there, when you see it, is a living descendant of the dinosaurs.
And what characteristics of the birds led scientists to understand the connection? What was it about birds that made people, as scientists, realize, these really were the dinosaurs that made it?
Well, a big shift in thinking about the connection to dinosaurs was back in the 80s and 90s. Scientists began to realize that dinosaurs weren't cold-blooded like reptiles, which is what they thought. They were warm-blooded, and they behaved much more like birds, they realized. In Montana here, we have a paleontologist who's named his big find, a myosaur. He named it Good Mother Dinosaur because it had a nest full of eggs. And that was one of the things that made scientists realize that this is much more bird-like animal than a reptile-like animal. And a friend of mine started drawing these animals looking very different, with their tails up, facing forward like we see in Jurassic Park, more bird-like than reptile-like. So in the last 20, 30 years, scientists have really realized that birds are much more like dinosaurs than we thought.
I believe one of the most fascinating stories that you tell in your book is how a scientist here at the University of Montana started to put together the pieces of how the wing might have evolved. It's one thing to think about a dinosaur that is land-bound, kind of running along, and then how or why would wings have evolved in the first place? It seems to be kind of a missing link there. But we have a local scientist, do we not, who has sort of fit that piece in together. And how did he do that?
There was a debate in the 1800s over what it was called, what good is half a wing, one of the scientists said. And he said, this is when evolution had first been proposed. And he said evolution couldn't be true because there would be no reason for a bird to have half of a wing, that God must have created birds and given it a whole wing to fly. But that debate has gone on for a long time. But modern day schools of thought on flight are that birds ran along the ground, chasing an insect perhaps, and they would leap up and grab an insect and then they would fly. And that's how the first flight began. And then the other school of thought is the top-down school of thought, where scientists proposed that birds climbed, got up onto a rock or tree, and then leapt out and glided to the ground and then eventually began flying. But it doesn't answer the question of why they would have wings to begin with. Well, work here at the University of Montana by Dr. Ken Dial. He studies living birds. His specialty is how birds move, and he puts birds in X-ray machines and wind tunnels and takes a lot of high-speed photography of them and to understand their physiology. And he weighed into the whole debate about the evolution of flight, and proposed that by watching chukar partridges, he watched them in the first days of their lives. They could run very well, and they could climb very well up hay bales that he had in his laboratory. And then eventually they started gliding off the hay bales. And after they glided for a while, their wings were big enough and they could actually fly. And this series of events, he believes, were how birds evolved, or dinosaurs evolved to fly over millions of years instead of several days like the partridges in his lab. But what he noticed when those birds first started running is that they used their stubby little wings as a way to balance themselves when they climbed or when they ran, and it was a tool for running. He calls it wing-assisted incline running. So they ran up something and they used their wings to balance themselves. And he believes that dinosaur wings started as a balancing tool, that they first needed them to run and escape predators, and eventually they could climb. And when they jumped off, those with the bigger half wings could glide better and escape predators better, and eventually they could fly. So that evolution of chukar partridges, babies going from 1 day old to 3 weeks or 4 weeks old and flying, essentially happened in the evolution of dinosaurs and how they began to fly.
Very fascinating.
It is fascinating,
yeah.
And it's a highly accepted idea. It's not settled, and maybe it will never be settled, but it's very interesting.
Yes. Well, let's talk about some of the aspects of birds that enable flight. Their weight, their feathers, their muscular structure, and you talk about a wide variety of birds that have various different mechanisms for various different aspects of this. For example, the hummingbird, which has a very different wing structure, mm-hmm. and has adapted to a very different environment. And I think that's one of the most fascinating aspects of birds, is they all have their little niche. And a niche in ecological terms is their little space within the larger landscape that they make their living. It could be, as in the case of hummingbirds, by eating nectar from flowers, or in the case of ospreys, by eating fish from a river. So could you talk us through a little bit of some of the aspects of the birds, the bird brain, and all of the ways in which it has adapted to flight?
Yeah, there are a lot of different things. One of the things actually they shared in common with dinosaurs is they have hollow bones. They have hollow bones because they need to be light and strong so that they can fly. They have feathers, which are incredibly strong, and birds can run run through a tangle of thorns and underbrush, and come out clean because their feathers are so strong. At the same time, that same feathers, the same wing and feathers on the bird are incredibly light, so that they can fly. So it's a highly sophisticated adaptation of feather. A simple feather is highly sophisticated, and we were talking yesterday. Not only do all these things happen with feathers, but every year birds get new feathers, and so they're renewed. So it's really amazing to think that these birds have adapted with feathers, which also do things like are attractions to other birds, for mating purposes. They have adapted through even things. I wanted to mention the feathers are made from keratin, which is a very lightweight protein, the same protein our nails and our hair are made out of. And their beak is also made from keratin, which is a very light and strong material. So that's another adaptation for flight, is having something strong enough to tear open a fish, but at the same time light enough to allow the bird to fly. They have incredible feet. We have a foot here, I think. And
yes, we do. And then talking about the foot of an osprey, it is unique even among the bird world. Birds have different formations of toes. Some have 3, some have 4. Is that not correct? Yep.
Mm-hmm.
And the osprey have a special toe that is able to move like our thumb. And that means that they can hold a fish in a torpedo-like position, which makes it very aerodynamically efficient to fly with a fish. And it also allows them to perch and hold fish for eating. But they have other adaptations on their feet. Can you come in on this, Jake? And close on the, we have an osprey's foot right here. And there are several aspects of the foot, in addition to the toe being movable to serve as a thumb. Take a handle on these talons. They are razor sharp, and so they're very efficient at grabbing a fish. Plus, on the bottom of the toes, there is almost a sandpaper-like quality to them. They're called specules, I believe. The tiny little raised portions of it must be skin that is almost like sandpaper and allows the foot to cling to a very slippery fish. Other birds, of course, have webbed feet for swimming. There's a whole range of different feet design, but each bird's feet seems to complement its use within its own niche within the ecosystem. So in additional aspects of the osprey, we were talking about the wing, that make it perfectly adapted to its particular niche, is its wing has a special kind of elbow right here, and instead of flapping up and down like this, when the osprey dives into the water, first of all, it can fold its wing very close to its body so that it becomes very air resistant. I mean, it minimizes the resistance both in the water and in the air, and it just dives straight down. But then once it gets in the water, it's able to carry a fish that is oftentimes almost as much weight as its own body. By using this special elbow on its wing, it puts its wing up like this and then captures more air. So it has an upward stroke with its wing that many other birds lack.
More thrust.
Yeah, more thrust. Mm-hmm. To get more air pressure to get the bird up out of the water. Many birds that are water birds use the surface of the water almost like a landing and a takeoff zone, like ducks, for example. They'll kind of walk on the water almost to catch enough air, but an osprey can come straight out of the water. Ospreys also have a special flap on their nose. so that when an osprey dives into the water, the flap closes so that water is not forced up into its nostril. They also have what's called a nictitating membrane on its eye, which is a second eyelid. And that eyelid keeps the eye moist while it's flying and hovering above the water to see the fish, but also closes when it hits the water so that it protects the eye, and yet they can see through it. Another aspect of the osprey is that they are able to locate a fish and to compensate for the optical illusions that are created by the water. When you're looking down in a pool of water, the fish is not really where you think it is because the light is refracted by the water. You can do this in your own bathtub sometime to understand that the water distorts the light rays. So the osprey strike where the fish is, not where it appears to be. And these are all adaptations that ospreys have made to exploit their particular niche. And they are one of the few birds that make their living exclusively from fish in this way.
Some members online have some questions. This is Jake from Dunrovin Ranch. We have a question about fish. If fish are scarce, do osprey feed on small rodents? And also, what else have osprey eat that would be considered atypical to their diet?
That's a really good question. The web cameras, by the way, have really helped us understand the answers to that question because you can watch exactly what comes up to the osprey's nest. And yes, osprey, there have been incidents of osprey eating small mammals and snakes, but those are very, very incidental, and I don't know that they are associated with shortages necessarily. It seems like when there are food shortages or problems with the fish in the local area, they fly farther away. They keep looking for fish. And an interesting aspect of that is rarely do they pick up a fish that they dropped. But they will not take fish normally from somebody handing them a fish, for example. And that's one of the reasons they've been very difficult to rehabilitate in raptor centers that rehabilitate raptors, is because they're very picky about their fish. Now, there are individual variations. In fact, there is a raptor center near Kalispell, Montana, that has an osprey. And it happens to be that this particular osprey has no hesitation in taking fish from people that she did not catch it. But we've tried this even at our nest. One year when the chicks were banded, we offered them a really nice trout that we bought at the store as compensation for the harassment of banding them, and they threw it off the nest. And I have seen fish being delivered at the nest. They'll fall off and they won't go and pick them up. However, a couple of years ago, I also noticed that Ozzy brought a huge fish one time. It fell off the nest and he did go down to the ground and pick it up. So fish are the primary source of food, but they have been known to eat other incidental things such as small rodents and snakes.
Didn't you say that you've seen bald eagles steal fish?
Yes, bald eagles, and in fact, bald eagles will watch osprey and wait for them to catch fish, and then attack the osprey for their fish. And we believe that that's how Harriet's first mate died, Ozzy. That particular year, we had multiple attacks at the nest by a pair of bald eagles that were nesting south of us. And we heard the eagle that day, and when we found his body, he had a big tear on his pectoral muscles, which would indicate a talon from an eagle. And many really good photographers have actually been able to capture air fights of osprey flying, and the eagle will fly underneath, turn upside down, and grab the fish with its talons. So there's quite a bit of competition between eagles and ospreys. Eagles also catch and eat fish, but they don't have the talents that the osprey do for the catching part. So they harass the ospreys. Mm-hmm. Good question.
I talk a little bit about the feet.
Yeah, absolutely. Please do. Here.
You can see how sharp these are. You can see a dinosaur with feet.
Yeah.
You can see a dinosaur having feet like this. But Dr. Dial, who did the work with the evolution of flight, also has studied how birds walk. And he says that these are probably, to him, the most amazing part of the bird, because while there are three styles of walking amongst all the animals in the world, including humans, and so each creature does something different in how it walks. But he says birds do all of those things. They can climb, they can walk, they can run, and they can catch fish. He said it's just like the Leatherman tool of feet, which it can do anything that they want it to do. And he has videos of birds not only walking, but climbing up the side of a building and even climbing over an underhang, because their feet are so amazing in what they can do. And it's really something to keep in mind with the bird. We don't think about their feet perhaps, but it's a highly evolved instrument for their survival.
A Leatherman.
A Leatherman,
that
yeah.
they have with them at all
times. A whole variety of different functions.
Yeah. For a long time, people thought birds weren't very smart. In fact, there's a term, bird brain, that was used for generations to denote somebody who wasn't all that clever. And this is just recently discovered that, in fact, while bird brains are different, that doesn't mean that they are less intelligent. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think maybe a century ago, a scientist was studying brains, and he noticed that mammals, a lot of different mammals, humans and monkeys and dogs and cats, all had a similar brain, and they had a cortex on top, and then a midbrain, and then a reptile brain, and it was like a layer cake. He described, or someone described it as a layer cake. When he opened up a bird brain, he said it was like a fruit cake. It was a mess, and it was all over the place, and it didn't make sense at all. And it led to this idea that bird brains are inferior to human brains. And it lasted for a long time, 100 years or so. But what was really going on, it was that it had evolved differently. It came from the same source. Originally, some people thought it was its own independent brain that had evolved separately, but it came to the similar conclusions. It could see and hear and do all those things that a human brain can do. But what experts have decided is that there was a source brain from which all brains came, reptile, mammal, and bird brains. But somehow, when the bird brain broke off from the others, it evolved with a very different look. But it has similar, what they call micro-architecture. The audio cortex, for example, is identical to the human audio cortex, which is the part of the brain that governs hearing. So it looks very different, but it functions very much the same. And it came from the same relative. No one knows, by the way, what that original brain was hundreds of millions of years ago that created our and bird brain and bird brains, but they're looking for it.
It's really interesting. In your book, you describe an IQ test that has been given to both humans and birds. And it's an IQ test that does not require language. Could you explain that to us and how the birds did?
iSync tech?
Yes.
Yeah, and
yes.
I think it was given to pigeons, and they performed better than humans did, than children did on some of the tests.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it consisted of symbols on keys, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they had to relate the same symbols. Mm-hmm. And clearly the birds weren't told what to do. They were just trained to get food from a particular symbol, and then they kept manipulating that symbol and changing it in ways.
Well, there's a famous crow, by the way, named Betty, who was put in a cage with another crow. It's a subspecies of crow called New Caledonian crow.
Uh-huh.
And this really wowed investigators and researchers when they saw this. They put them in a cage and gave them a bucket of meat, and they had to use a hooked piece of wire to get the meat out to eat it. Right. And they could do that. And when they put them in the cage, Abel the crow, there were two two birds, Betty and Abel. Abel the crow grabbed the hooked wire and fetched out the meat from the bucket. Betty saw that Abel had taken the hook, but there was another piece of wire, so she picked it up and bent it into a hook in order to get the meat. And that was the first time that researchers believed had seen a bird make a tool from a novel material. And they were absolutely astounded. No one had ever observed that in a bird, that they actually could make tools. Now, not all birds do that, very few. But it shows you the incredible intelligence of a bird. And it's only been in the last 20 or 30 years that we've started to really understand how much smarter birds are than we know.
Yeah. They also collaborate, don't they? Some birds exist in large flocks, like starlings, and I don't know if all of you have seen what's called a murmuration of starlings, where they just flow together as one unit, which is in itself a mystery as to how they are able to coordinate their flight so carefully, like a school of fish. It just moves together as a single unit. But then there are other birds that do what is called fission and fusion, which is more like what humans do. And they gather at certain times for certain things, and then they separate and gather with other birds for other purposes.
Mm-hmm.
One of the most fascinating stories I found in your book was that of the ravens and the wolves. And could you tell that story to the children?
One of the reasons they think that ravens are so smart is because something called the social complexity hypothesis, which is that when you live in a complex society like humans do, that there's lots of things you need to know and to remember and pay attention to in order to get along. Mm-hmm. The fission fusion you talked about. So kids who are in school, they get up in the morning with their family, and they know their family, and they know that when mom makes breakfast or they make breakfast or whatever. They go to school, they have all their friends at school, they in their class, they know them, they know who's their friend and who's maybe not their friend, and who they're going to see at the end of the day. And then they go to lunch with a different group of kids, and then they go back to school, and then off to soccer practice or baseball practice, and it's a whole nother group. And so coming together, splitting up, coming together again, splitting up is one of those things that sharpens your ability, your memory, and how you pay attention. Mm-hmm. Now, ravens do this amongst themselves. There's a sophisticated raven society in which they know who their friends are, and they groom allies, and they go to war with other allies, with other ravens over nest sites and food. And so there's a complex society amongst ravens. But when wolves enter the picture, there's also a complex society amongst ravens and wolves. So all of those things, remembering which wolf might kill you, which one won't, remembering how fast one wolf is, and whether you can get in there and get some meat before, on an elk kill, before the wolf gets you. Those kinds of things all sharpen a raven's intelligence.
I thought very fascinating. In your book, you described that when a raven comes on a kill, and if they're unable to open it up properly, they actually make a lot of noise to bring the wolves.
That's right. They'll call. They can't open up a carcass if they see a dead elk.
Right.
But they can call in a wolf, and they'll do that because they're mobile. They have a high vantage, right. So they'll fly around. They'll see a carcass a long ways off. They'll land, or they won't land, perhaps, and then they'll just call out, and the wolf will hear it and know where that carcass is, and then the wolf comes and cuts open the carcass with its teeth, and then the raven can eat along with the wolves. So it's
by darting in and out and knowing which wolf is. Right,
they're partners.
Yeah. It's fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah,
that they've developed this synergistic relationship. Yeah.
We have some other questions.
Oh, good.
We have some questions about why don't the ospreys scare off the smaller birds that are on their nest, and also what diseases are osprey prone to?
Pardon? What
diseases?
Oh, that's a really good question. That's a question that I don't know that I know, in fact, about the diseases of ospreys. I would be happy to look it up, and we can pass it on to to students. I will look that up. That's a very good question. With respect to the little birds, first of all, I'm going to tell a story about the nest itself. We had the nest moved off of an electrical pole when we had the web camera installed above the nest. Montana Northwest Energy came out and moved that nest, and they estimated that the nest weighed between 350 and 400 pounds. We don't know exactly how long that nest has been there, but it's been there at least the 20 years that we've lived here, and probably a lot longer, because it was a big nest when we arrived here. But the little birds underneath Osprey represent no threat whatsoever to them, so they just don't care about them. They're neither a food source, nor are they a threat of any kind, so they just leave them be. But for the little birds, it's a great benefit, because they can make their nests in the catacombs underneath the main part of the nest. And the ospreys, in fact, protect the little birds because they won't let other hawks or eagles come near their nest. So the little birds enjoy this great beneficial relationship with the ospreys, and I don't know that the ospreys get anything at all out of it, but the little birds certainly do. Not all ospreys' nests are as big or as complex as this nest. If you look at other ospreys' nests, they're smaller, and they don't seem to have the same kind of nesting going on underneath them. So I think this is a little bit of a unique situation here at Dunrovin. And with respect to the diseases, I will indeed look that up, but I do know that they were almost extinct in the lower 48 because of DDT in the 1960s, just like eagles were. So they are a conservation success story. They've really proliferated throughout the lower 48 states since the DDT was banned. And that dealt with the thinness of their eggs that they couldn't reproduce.
Our member Lynn looked up a disease called aspergillosis, which is a fungal plague, and which eagles who are also immune suppressed can fall victim to. So that's one plague on osprey. There's another good question about what questions about osprey and osprey behavior are researchers still unsure about and are still trying to answer.
Well, that's an interesting question too. The web cameras have actually opened up new questions, because very frequently ospreys will surprise us in terms of what we're seeing at distinctive ospreys' nests. So, for example, the whole mating pattern of ospreys, there have been some surprises. Some ospreys actually have two partners. There have been known to be 3 birds in one nest, for example. And these are the kinds of things that people didn't know about until you put up the osprey, the web cameras. But there's still a lot of mystery about, for example, how do the ospreys know where to migrate? Well, I mean, if the chick fledges and it migrates, and who tells it where to go? How does it know to do that? That's a huge mystery. Migration is still very much a mystery throughout the bird world. Mm-hmm. How the mechanisms and the background of migration is very mysterious, and there's some really big examples of mysterious migrations. Do you have some that you might want to contribute?
Well, there are birds that, well, one of the interesting things I think is that there are scientists, researchers who believe that through an unusual process called quantum entanglement, that birds can see magnetic lines on the planet when they migrate. And that's one possibility. No one knows how birds migrate entirely. They have ideas that they can see certain landforms, or that they use constellations and different angle of the sun and so on, but no one really knows. And one of the newest theories is that birds migrate through this really unusual process called quantum entanglement. They have a chemical in their eye that allows them to see this very faint magnetic line on the planet. It's 1/100th the power of a refrigerator magnet.
My goodness.
So, but yet somehow these birds can follow this, and it's like one of the newest theories and one of the most out there theories.
Wow.
Now, what you said, by the way, that web cameras have opened up new questions about
yes.
osprey. Have they also answered questions about
Oh,
osprey?
yes, they have.
What would some of those be?
Well, some of them are the individual variation between the birds, for example, and uh, uh, just by looking at different osprey web cameras, you can see that not all of the birds cope with with life in the same way. For example, the question that the students have been trying to answer is the amount of incubation that the male does versus the female. There's a great deal of variation between pairs. Some males only incubate very infrequently, whereas other males incubate a lot, and some even over 50%.
Hmm.
So there's a great deal of variation in the individual's behavior with respect to various aspects. I was going to mention that we do have some information on the migration of our Montana ospreys. There's a osprey nest that's just south of Dunrovin, where they put a radio collar on a chick that during its first year, it migrated to the Gulf of Mexico, which seems to be where most of the ospreys in Montana migrate to. And the reason they know that is through these bands. Can you put the camera on this band, Jake? It's a leg band. And many of you who have watched the osprey camera here know that right when the chicks are just old enough to be handled safely, yet can't fly, the scientists will come and go up in a bucket truck and weigh the chicks, take some blood samples, and put on leg bands. This is a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service leg band that has a special code on it that tells anybody who finds this leg band could turn. University of Montana has done an additional thing.
Suzanne?
Yes.
There's some questions about the longest known migrations. What's the farthest one? What's the farthest that osprey can migrate?
I don't know the answer in terms of the farthest. I do know that this particular bird that I'm talking about migrated from Nicaragua to Alaska, which is a good distance. I don't believe that osprey migrate across the equator, that they migrate between the hemispheres, whereas some birds like the Arctic tern does migrate between the hemispheres. And I think the Arctic tern might have one of the longest migration routes for birds. Don't quote me on that, but there's a wonderful YouTube video if the teachers want to look up Arctic tern. There's a terrific little video about their migration routes and the extraordinary distances that they travel. But and I don't know whether the osprey do it in one continuous effort, or whether they make pit stops along the way, like geese do when they're migrating. They will stop and forage for a while, and that's why many of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service bird migration refuges are so important, because they are intermediate stops. For example, when the geese fly from the southern United States all the way up into the Arctic, and they make stops along the way.
We have some questions about how fast osprey dive into the water when they catch fish, how Hal and Harriet got their names, and how many osprey die on average each year.
Okay, let me make sure I understood the questions. How fast they are flying, or how fast they are going into the water?
How fast they dive, yes.
I don't know the answer to that question either. I don't know the exact speed, but I do know that they can go down to 3 feet beneath the water to catch a fish. But I don't know that it's been clocked, an osprey's dive. It probably has been, and that's another question that I'll be happy to look up. And what was the other question, Jake?
How Hal and Harriet got their names, and how many osprey chicks on average die each year.
How many die?
Yes.
Okay. The survival rate, I did look that up last night. The survival rate for chicks is somewhere between, or the mortality rate, the number of chicks that die, is somewhere between 45 and 70% of the clutch. So that means in a really good year, almost half still die, even in a very good year. And a very bad year, 70% of the chicks will die. And that means the chicks within an area, not specifically within a specific nest. And that's one of the things that we're finding out with the web cameras, is that osprey nests that have alternative resources are much more successful than osprey nests that are depending on a single resource. And the other thing that we're learning is the amount of learning that goes on through the process. And we've had a very good opportunity to see that both here at the Dunrovin nest and also at the Hellgate nest. Both the Hellgate nest and the Dunrovin nest have new male ospreys, Hal for our nest and Lewis for the Hellgate nest. And in both cases, there was a learning process that you could actually watch. And the Hellgate nest suffered total losses for 2 years in a row, in part because Lewis did not know about alternative resources. He was unable to get fish during really bad times. Hal here was able to get fish during really bad times because he more quickly discovered the alternative places to the Bitterroot River and was bringing in fish that don't come from the Bitterroot River. And again, the web cameras allow us to see that. With respect to the name of Hal and Harriet, Harriet has been here since we've been here, and it's a name that I just gave her from a TV sitcom or a TV family show in the 1950s called Ozzie and Harriet, and so I named the male Ozzie and the female Harriet. And then Ozzie died, was killed by an eagle, and the next year Harriet returned alone, and it was a lot of pandemonium broke out because there were lots of available suitors. It was like she raised the flag that said, wealthy widow with nest, and the male ospreys were flying around, and many of them were coming and going, and finally she settled on one, and the name came from the fact that all of us who were watching said, "Hallelujah, she has a mate," and so Hal is for hallelujah. Hallelujah, she has a mate. And if the children want to continue to watch our camera as the chicks hatch, they just need to go to www.days@dunrovin.com, and we will accept suggestions for the names of the chicks as they hatch. Was there another question, Jake?
There are a couple. How long can an osprey go without food? And how long does it take a baby osprey to learn to fly?
Those are good questions. Again, I'm not exactly sure of how long they can go without it, but we have seen Harriet go several days without food. I think an adult is quite capable of going without food for some time, but a chick is not, and that's really the issue during the time that the chicks are being fed. You can practically see the chicks grow. They grow so fast. They just you can see the feathers emerge. You can just watch them gain weight and change, and there is a phase, in fact, where they look very much like dinosaurs. I mean, you can see the dinosaur connection in those baby chicks. So a baby chick can't go very long without food. And I don't think it can go more than about 25 hours without food. So during the times when the chicks are small, they have a really difficult time if they don't have a constant food source. In terms of flying, it takes about 55 days from the time an osprey chick is hatched until it flies away from the nest. And fledging means to fly away from the nest. You will see a lot of practice flying. I hope the children do watch this summer, because in July you'll start seeing the osprey chicks practice, and they do what we call helicoptering. They fly up off of the nest, and then they fly back down. And in fact, last year during one of the chicks helicopter practicing, it missed the nest entirely and ended up on the roof of our barn. And maybe you could mention that a little bit, Jake, since you were here during that. Do you want to tell the kids the story of what happened next?
Sure. So one of the osprey, Honk, the baby fledglings, landed on top of our barn, but she couldn't fly back up. So it was a rough night for her because she had to learn how to fly much quicker than she had originally, than she should have. And we had a wedding here that day, and people from the wedding were tracking the Osprey, and we were tracking her as well. It was a really fun evening, although we were worried for her. But she made it back the next morning.
Yeah, it was a unique situation where people on the ground and people online were all looking for the same bird. Any other questions from the children?
Are osprey ever hunted? How is the osprey's nest structured?
Ospreys are hunted in terms of human hunting. It's not allowed. It's illegal to hunt ospreys, but certainly in the past they were hunted, and just as eagles were hunted in the past as well. The osprey nests are enormous, and this particular nest has been built up over many, many years. But during the early spring, it's really fun to watch. The osprey will fly through the forest near the river, and you can hear them snap off limbs of the tree to break off and take home to the nest. So during the first several weeks while they're mating, the primary focus of their activities is to build up their nest, because during the winter the nest will become very flat. It'll still stay there and during unbelievable storms, by the way. This is so well constructed that winds of 60, 80, 90 miles an hour do not knock it off or do not tear it apart. So it's a real catacomb. But both birds will participate. They bring in sticks, sometimes from the ground, but most often you'll see them fly right through the trees and break off a stick with their talons and fly it back and then place it within the nest. And once they get what we on the web cameras call the sideboards of the crib done, then they will create what's called the nest cup. And the nest cup is really constructed to keep the eggs warm, to develop almost an incubator-like environment for them to sit on. And each bird has what's called an incubation patch, which brings their skin right up close to the eggs. So in this particular case, the birds use two different kinds of material for their nest cup. First of all, they steal my hay. And I think they should be paying me.
Do they use baling twine too?
Oh, I'll talk about baling twine in a minute. Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. The baling twine that is used to hold hay is extremely dangerous to ospreys. Ospreys are used to looking on the ground for things like hay or grass that they can pull off to make that soft place for their eggs. And of course, baling twine is incredibly strong. It won't come apart. And you'll see nests all over Montana where baling twine is just hanging down from the osprey's nest, and osprey can get their feet caught in it and can actually die and can't get out of the nests. That's also happened with fishing line. They go to catch a fish in the water, and they end up with fishing line on their talons, and it gets caught in the catacombs of their nest, and then they can't leave the nest and they starve. It's just tragic. So the University of Montana has collaborated with Northwest Energy to put on a statewide program about baling twine and encourage ranchers to pick up their baling twine. And as anybody who works at Dunrovin knows, we are absolutely strict about our baling twine. It is never found on the ground. And we have, University of Montana claims we have the cleanest nest around in terms of baling twine. But it's also important that fishermen don't leave their fishing unused line around the rivers, because it can endanger not just osprey but all kinds of other animals and birds. So they use the hay, which I can catch them stealing out of our pastures, but they also do a really interesting thing which I find fascinating, and that is they bring the bark of the cottonwood. That cottonwood, they'll bring a big piece of bark up to the nest, and then they will strip out the inside of the bark, and it makes this really beautiful duff that is, just these small paper-like strips, and you'll see them up there in the spring using their beaks to strip the bark right out, strip the insides out of the bark and put it in their nest. In fact, earlier this year, Hal brought up a big long rope of it, and it was hanging from the perch for the longest time of the insides of cottonwood bark. And I'm going to tell another story, which is a fascinating thing to me. Some time ago, I had a woman give a workshop here on what is called zoopharmacognosy. Okay, I think that's a big word. Zoological, animals, pharmaceuticals, cognosy, knowledge. And the theory is that animals know how to medicate themselves with different pharmaceutical plants in the environment. And one day, after the osprey had left, I saw a kestrel, which is the smallest bird of prey in North America, beautiful little bird, landed on the osprey's nest. And as a bird of prey, they do not eat vegetation. They eat small mice. They'll capture other birds, but they don't eat vegetation. Kestrels don't. But I saw this little bird stripping the bark and eating it. And I then contacted my friend, and I said, and I got this on film. I said, "What's happening here? This kestrel is eating the inner part of cottonwood bark." And come to find out, it does have an anesthetic quality. In fact, Native Americans used it as an anesthetic.
Well, it may be related to willows, and willows is where aspirin comes from, the compound, the salicylic acid. And I know bees will take resin from willows and line their nests with it because it's an antibiotic, it's an antifungal, and it's a chemopreventative. It prevents cancer. And so willow trees are really important to the health, keeping disease from the animal world. And also, if you think about it, willows line all the waterways and lakes. They take up the water and respire it. So there may be a filtering aspect to willows, and it's removing any kind of pathogens from the water.
Yeah.
It's a poorly studied area, but there's some hypothesis about the role that willows and others in the family play in terms of keeping the biosphere free of disease.
This brings up the topic that you go into in great into some detail in your book, and that is what we can learn from birds by watching birds, what humans can learn about their environment. And could you elaborate a little bit on that?
Well,
your thesis?
Yeah, I call the book an interpretation of birds, and it's what kinds of questions can we ask of birds so that we can learn something. One of the questions I'm interested in is how do other cultures relate to birds? It's very different, and many cultures are different from other cultures, and there's lots to learn. For some people in South America that I've written about, they consider birds companions rather than an object. It's more of a subject. They're very related to birds. They whistle, and the birds whistle back. When they travel, certain birds travel with them. And so there's lots of different ways that other cultures relate to birds. They eat them sometimes, and some in Indonesia, some cultures consider birds to be reincarnation of their family. So it's a whole range of things I think we could ask about birds. We can ask what we don't know about birds, and why don't we know those things, and what other kinds of questions can we ask to learn about the things that we don't know. So there's lots to learn about birds. I hope some people who are kids who are watching this will say they'd like to go into the field of ornithology to learn more about birds.
Yes, I hope that all of you take notice of the birds in your own backyard. You know, just getting the opportunity to watch these ospreys, I hope it opens a door for you to notice your own birds. There are birds everywhere, and take the enjoyment and the wonder of birds from your own backyard into your heart. It will teach you a lot. Are there any other questions, Jake? I think we're right at our stopping point.
We have one more good one. How do you tell the bird's gender?
Well, you can't just from looking at most birds, except in terms of plumage. Males very often have a more colorful plumage to attract the females. Some some bird species are very different, male between female. Other bird species are not. Eagles, for example, and ospreys. The only distinction with ospreys is the females are generally about a third larger. They often have a very clear necklace, or that is the brown feathers on its front is thicker generally than the males. But that's really the only clues that you have in terms of looking at an osprey and telling whether it's a male or a female. But if you were to look at, for example, a male sparrow versus a female, they're distinctive. And there's finches that are distinctive. You know, lots of species have very distinct colorations. Ducks, for example, mallard ducks, you can tell a female from a male very readily by their plumage. And it's the males of the world, unlike the humans. It seems like in the human world, the females are the ones that dress up with all the colors. But in the bird world, it's the males.
I just learned from a scientist, by the way, that it's always been said that the male of the species sing almost exclusively. And what they realize now is that's not true. That female birds of the birds that sing also sing. The scientists hadn't noticed it before.
That's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and that's all. A lot of the singing has to do with reproduction and attracting a mate.
Territory.
Territory. Well, children, thank you so much for participating in our project. I hope you've enjoyed your time with Harriet and Hal, and I hope you'll join us next year. We'll probably do the same project again. And Jim, I want to thank you so much for coming.
You're welcome. My pleasure.
And I really encourage all of you to get a copy of Jim's book. It's just so fun. It's not just the science of birds, it's the mythology of birds and all these wonderful stories of the way birds have interacted with us, with our environment, form part of our mythology and our spiritual life as well as our everyday life. It's just great. Thank you very much. And with that, we'll sign off. Goodbye, and thank you for joining us.